when the harbor did not ask for ships. The harbor looks finished long before it feels awake. Stone edges hold their shape. Wooden posts keep standing. The water does what it always does, without needing an audience. Nothing here is broken. Nothing here is waiting in panic. The absence of ships is not dramatic. It is simply noticeable in the way silence becomes noticeable when it stays long enough to feel intentional. Late-night history prefers moments like this. They arrive without urgency. They do not announce importance. They sit quietly and let the body decide whether to listen. If this calm makes your breathing slower and your thoughts less eager to perform, then you are already doing exactly what this hour requires. There is no sense of delay in the air. The harbor is not behind schedule. It is not missing an appointment with the future. Around the year 850, this place existed the same way it does now, complete, functional, unused. The water reaches the edge and stops. The posts mark where ships could be without demanding that they arrive. Nothing in the scene suggests that activity is overdue. This is important. Many places in history are not paused. They are simply not busy. Late-night history pays attention to these scenes because they are honest. When nothing is happening, there is nothing to exaggerate. No one needs to speak louder to be remembered. No event asks for framing. The harbor does not perform significance. It simply remains. The idea that history must always move forward is convenient but inaccurate. Sometimes it stands still. Sometimes it rests without asking permission. Sometimes it continues by doing nothing at all. The people nearby understand this better than later historians ever will. They do not measure the harbor by how many ships arrive in a season. They measure it by how it holds its shape through winters that do not care about trade. A harbor that survives without ships is still a harbor. It still knows what it is. The wood does not complain about being unused. The water does not feel embarrassed by the lack of reflection from sails. Everything is where it should be. That is enough. There is a certain confidence in a structure that does not need constant proof of relevance. The harbor was built to receive movement, but it does not panic when movement fails to appear. This is a trait rarely celebrated. In modern storytelling, inactivity looks like loss. Here it looks like patience. The stones stay cold. The water stays level. The shore accepts both with equal calm. No one gathers to explain the situation because there is nothing to explain. If you stand here long enough, the silence stops feeling empty. It becomes full in a quieter way. Small sounds return, water against wood, wind passing without instruction, the sound of something adjusting slightly and then stopping. These are not signals. They are reminders that life continues even when it does not announce itself. The harbor is not asleep. It is simply not performing. There is also something gently ironic in how prepared everything remains. Ropes hang ready. Space exists for cargo that is not coming. The harbor is generous with possibilities that no one is using. It does not take this personally. It does not question its purpose. It keeps offering function without demanding results. Many systems would benefit from learning this posture. Late-night history notices these places because they resist summary. Nothing here can be resolved. There is no turning point hiding behind the fog. The harbor does not build toward a lesson. It does not teach through contrast. It simply exists as evidence that continuity does not require constant motion. This makes it less useful for textbooks and more useful for nights like this. As the light lowers, the harbor changes very little. Shadows lengthen without meaning. The water darkens without symbolism. The absence of ships does not become more dramatic at night, it becomes more honest. When there is nothing to see, there is also nothing to interpret. The scene asks only for presence. It does not demand understanding. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you are welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and allows these nights to continue unfolding without interruption. Nothing here needs to happen. Nothing here is building toward an ending. The harbor remains. The water holds. Time moves without needing attention. Now rest. Northern Europe at rest? Northern Europe in the 9th century was not a machine that ran without pause. It did not hum endlessly with movement or produce a steady rhythm of ships arriving and leaving on schedule. That image belongs to much later expectations. In reality, this region moved in fits and pauses. It advanced when conditions allowed and rested when they did not. Late-night history feels most at home in these intervals because they reveal how normal stillness once was. The North did not measure its value by constant activity. It measured survival by knowing when to stop. Coasts along the North Sea and the Baltic existed in a relationship with water that was practical rather than romantic. The sea was not an invitation. It was a condition. Sometimes it cooperated. Often it did not. Movement across it was seasonal and cautious. Travel depended on light weather and predictable winds. When those conditions disappeared, the region did not force continuity. It accepted interruption as part of the arrangement. This acceptance made long periods of quiet feel ordinary rather than alarming. Trade in this world did not flow smoothly. It arrived in bursts. A good season could bring exchange and contact and noise. A poor season brought nothing at all. The absence of ships did not signal failure. It signaled awareness. Communities understood that waiting was cheaper than risk. They knew that losing momentum was better than losing people and tools. The idea that commerce must remain active year-round would have sounded unnecessary and slightly irresponsible. Rivers extended this rhythm inland, but they did not erase it. Waterways connected settlements only when water levels allowed passage. High water opened routes. Low water closed them without apology. People adapted. They stored goods. They delayed plans. They shifted attention to tasks that did not require travel. There was no central authority insisting that movement continue for the sake of appearance. No one needed to justify inactivity to an audience. Modern narratives often struggle with this kind of pacing. We like our histories busy. We prefer movement because movement feels meaningful. Stillness feels empty to us because we associate it with neglect. In the 9th century, stillness meant something else. It meant caution. It meant restraint. It meant understanding limits. These were not signs of decline, they were signs of competence. Northern Europe did not experience time as a continuous forward push. Time arrived in segments. There were seasons for leaving and seasons for staying. There were years that produced stories and years that produced nothing worth retelling. Those quiet years were not considered wasteful. They were simply years that did not volunteer for memory. Late-night history finds a certain comfort in this humility. Not everything asked to be recorded. Not everything needed a narrative. Ports and settlements remained functional even when unused. A harbor without ships was not abandoned. It was resting. Infrastructure was built to endure pauses. Wood and stone were chosen for patience rather than spectacle. Nothing here needed constant validation. A place could exist fully while doing very little. That idea tends to unsettle modern observers who equate worth with output. There is also a mild irony in how later centuries misread this pattern. Looking back, we often imagine the North as perpetually restless, always moving, always expanding. The evidence suggests something quieter. Movement was deliberate, expansion was episodic. Long stretches of restraint held everything together. The region survived not by pressing forward relentlessly, but by knowing when to remain still. People living along these coasts did not wake each morning expecting change. They expected repetition. Days looked similar, work adjusted to conditions. When ships did not come, the day did not collapse. Other tasks filled the space: repairs, storage, waiting. None of these required explanation. They were understood as part of living near water that did not negotiate. Late-night history notices how little anxiety surrounded interruption. There was no panic in the absence of trade, no rush to invent alternatives that mimicked activity. Silence was not interpreted as danger. It was interpreted as weather behaving as expected. The sea was unpredictable but not personal. People responded by stepping back rather than pushing harder. This rhythm also shaped how information moved. News traveled when people traveled. When routes closed, news stopped. Knowledge did not circulate endlessly. It arrived in clusters and then faded. This limited awareness created a different relationship with time. Events elsewhere did not feel urgent when no one was arriving to report them. Local life continued without reference to distant developments. That was not ignorance. It was proportion. The idea of a region that functioned intermittently challenges modern expectations of progress. We assume improvement requires constant engagement. Northern Europe demonstrates a different logic. Stability came from respecting natural limits. Movement was an option, not an obligation. Activity was seasonal, not permanent. This approach did not prevent growth. It shaped it into something slower and more durable. Late-night history does not frame this as a lesson. It observes it as a condition. The North did not need to justify its pauses. It did not label them setbacks. It simply incorporated them into the rhythm of existence. Ports waited. Rivers lowered. Coasts stayed quiet. Life did not feel interrupted because interruption was already part of the design. As night settles over this landscape, the absence of motion becomes easier to understand. Darkness removes the expectation of productivity. The region looks comfortable in low light. Nothing appears unfinished. Nothing seems late. The North rests the way it always has, without apology, without urgency, without the need to explain why nothing is happening. A harbor built for waiting. The harbor does not announce itself. It sits where land loosens its grip and water agrees to stop pretending it is endless. Wooden posts rise from the edge with no urgency. Stone boundaries hold their line without enthusiasm. Nothing here leans forward. Nothing strains toward the horizon. This is a place designed to exist even when it is not being used. Late-night history is drawn to structures like this because they do not beg for relevance. They remain steady while time does whatever it wants. A northern harbor in the 9th century was not a stage waiting for actors. It was more like a room left prepared after a gathering that might never happen. The wooden piers were built thick and low. They did not stretch dramatically into the water. They accepted the shoreline as it was, rather than attempting to dominate it. Planks were laid with the expectation of weight, but not with the demand that weight arrive on schedule. The harbor understood that presence and absence were equally possible outcomes. Storage buildings lined the edge with practical restraint. They were not impressive structures. They did not compete for attention. Their purpose was simple: hold what arrives, protect what stays, survive what waits. Inside them, space existed for goods that were not there. Empty shelves were not a sign of failure. They were part of the design. These buildings were patient by intention. They were built to be useful and to be ignored for long stretches of time. The paths that connected land to water were worn into place gradually. Ramps for dragging hulls rested at angles that assumed repetition but did not insist on it. A harbor could go months without seeing a vessel, and these paths would still make sense. The grooves in the wood and earth did not demand fresh marks to justify their existence. They remembered previous use quietly and waited without expectation. What is striking about these harbors is not what they contain, but what they tolerate. They tolerate emptiness without collapsing into neglect. They tolerate silence without being redefined as abandoned. In modern thinking, a place without activity is often described as dead. This harbor resists that interpretation. It is not dead, it is inactive. Those are different conditions. One implies failure, the other implies restraint. Late-night history notices how carefully this restraint is built into the structure itself. Nothing here is temporary in the emotional sense. The materials assume long intervals between moments of relevance. Wood is chosen not because it is light, but because it can endure damp and delay. Stone is placed where erosion is slow. The harbor is not optimized for speed. It is optimized for survival. There is also a quiet irony in how prepared everything remains. Ropes hang coiled and ready without any urgency behind them. Mooring points stand empty but intact. Space exists for cargo that does not arrive. The harbor offers hospitality without insisting on guests. It does not close itself when ships are absent. It remains open out of habit rather than hope. This design reflects a worldview that does not require constant confirmation. People who built these places understood that usefulness does not have to be immediate. They accepted that some years would produce nothing worth unloading. They did not respond by tearing things down or repurposing them in panic. They allowed the harbor to wait because waiting was part of its function. In this context, waiting is not passive. It is an active decision to remain prepared without forcing outcomes. The harbor does not chase opportunity. It positions itself to receive it when conditions allow. This attitude feels unfamiliar in a culture that treats inactivity as waste. Here, inactivity is maintenance. The harbor stays intact precisely because it is not pushed beyond what the environment supports. Standing at the edge of such a harbor, the absence of ships does not feel dramatic. It feels settled. The water meets the posts and moves on. The air carries no expectation. There is nothing to watch for, no signal to interpret. This lack of instruction is unsettling in a subtle way. Without movement, there is nothing to follow. Without events, there is nothing to anticipate. The harbor offers no narrative, it offers only presence. Late-night history finds humor in this refusal to perform. The harbor is ready for commerce but does not advertise itself. It does not decorate its emptiness with meaning. It simply remains available. This kind of confidence is rare in historical storytelling. We prefer places that either flourish or collapse. A place that neither thrives nor fails but simply waits is harder to categorize. The people living near the harbor do not see it as unfinished. They do not wake each day measuring its success by activity. They understand that it exists on a longer schedule. When ships do not come, they do not interpret that as rejection. They adjust. Work shifts inward. Maintenance replaces exchange. Time slows without resistance. There is also an acceptance that not every season deserves to be remembered. The harbor will not produce a story every year. Some years will pass without leaving a trace worth recording. This does not trouble anyone involved. Memory is not treated as an obligation. The harbor does not demand to be part of history. It accepts anonymity with composure. As daylight fades, the harbor does not change its posture. Darkness does not turn it into something else. It looks the same. Ready, empty, complete. The waiting becomes more visible at night because distractions fall away. Without light, the absence of ships feels less like a condition and more like a state. The harbor belongs to itself rather than to expectation. Late night history lingers here because this scene does not resolve. There is no arrival coming to justify the wait. There is no explanation waiting to be revealed. The harbor exists as proof that infrastructure can be built around patience rather than urgency. It demonstrates that some systems are designed not to perform but to endure. In a world increasingly shaped by speed, this harbor feels almost defiant. It does not optimize. It does not adapt to demand. It holds its shape and waits. That waiting is not hopeful or anxious. It is neutral. It assumes that time will do what it does and that forcing it rarely improves outcomes. The unsettling quality of this place comes from its refusal to align with modern instincts. It does not signal progress. It does not promise return. It simply remains capable. The harbor is not suspended between past and future. It exists fully in the present moment of readiness. This readiness without expectation creates a kind of quiet stability. Nothing here feels provisional. Nothing feels temporary. The harbor is not a placeholder for something better. It is already what it was meant to be, a structure that can accept activity without requiring it. A place that understands that waiting is not the absence of purpose, but one of its forms. Late night history does not ask this harbor to teach anything. It observes it as it is, built to wait, content to remain, untroubled by silence. The water stays, the posts hold, the space remains open. Nothing arrives. Nothing needs to. The harbor continues doing exactly what it was designed to do. The years when the sea did not cooperate. There were years when the sea simply refused to participate, not in anger, not in spectacle. It did not rise up to make a point or collapse into chaos to create memory. It just became inconvenient. Wind arrived from the wrong direction and stayed there longer than expected. Water levels shifted slightly and then refused to correct themselves. Ice formed early and left late. Currents slowed or bent, just enough to make effort feel unnecessary. Nothing dramatic happened. That was precisely the problem. Late night history finds these years especially revealing. They do not fit comfortably into timelines built around action. They do not offer clean reasons or satisfying outcomes. They sit quietly between more interesting seasons and wait to be forgotten. The sea does not explain itself. It never has. In these years, it does not even pretend to be useful. For those living along the northern coasts, the sea was not a symbol. It was a condition that needed to be tolerated. Some years it allowed movement, other years it discouraged it without apology. Wind could flatten sails before they mattered. Swells could turn routine travel into a prolonged argument with water that was not interested in compromise. When this happened repeatedly, people learned to stop insisting. The decision not to sail was rarely dramatic. It was made in increments, One delay led to another. Repairs were postponed because there was no point hurrying. Supplies stayed on land longer than planned. Eventually, the idea of departure lost momentum. This was not fear. It was efficiency. Leaving when the sea behaved badly offered no advantage. Weather in these regions did not arrive as an event. It lingered. Gray conditions stacked on top of each other until they felt permanent. Cold pressed in without ceremony. Rain arrived not as a storm, but as persistence. It soaked wood slowly. It made surfaces heavier. It changed the cost of movement. None of this required interpretation. It required adjustment. Ice was especially persuasive. When it appeared, it did not announce a deadline. It spread quietly. Thin layers formed in sheltered water. Then thicker ones followed. At first, it only slowed activity. Later, it stopped it. No one negotiated with ice. It was easier to wait than to test how serious it was. The sea in these moments was not hostile. It was uninterested. Currents also played their part. In years when flow shifted slightly, the effort required to move against it increased just enough to make the journey unappealing. Boats could still move. They simply took longer. That extra time meant more exposure, more supplies, more risk, for no additional reward. The sea did not forbid travel. It made it inefficient. That was often enough. Late-night history notices how rarely these conditions were framed as adversity. There was no sense of being wronged. Nature was not cast as an opponent. It was treated as a variable that occasionally removed itself from the equation. When that happened, plans adjusted quietly. Activity folded inward. Life continued at a smaller radius. These were not years of despair. They were years of recalibration. Coastal communities understood that movement was optional. Staying put did not mean stagnation. It meant survival with fewer complications. Time was not wasted waiting. It was repurposed. Maintenance replaced exchange. Storage replaced transport. Preparation replaced ambition. The sea did not demand attention during these periods. It asked only to be left alone. Waves continued to move, but without rhythm that invited participation. The surface looked usable from a distance, but resisted once approached. This ambiguity made restraint sensible. There was no clear signal saying now or never. There was only a growing sense that now was not the time. Late-night history finds a mild irony in how these years contrast with later narratives. We often imagine northern waters as routes of constant movement, trade flowing steadily, ships appearing as reliably as seasons. The reality was far less accommodating. Long stretches passed where the sea offered no cooperation at all. These stretches rarely appear in records because they produced nothing to record. Silence has poor archival value. A season of bad wind leaves little trace. Ice that stops travel does not write reports. Currents that discourage movement do not sign their work. The absence of voyages rarely becomes an entry. As a result, these years slip through memory. They exist only in the adjustments people made quietly. Those adjustments were practical rather than emotional. People did not need reassurance that things would improve. They assumed conditions would change eventually. The question was not whether the sea would cooperate again, but when. Until then, effort was redirected. Skills that did not require travel gained importance. Local tasks filled the days. Late-night history appreciates how unromantic this response was. There was no dramatic waiting, no staring at the horizon, no symbolic gestures toward absence. The sea was treated like a tool that occasionally stopped working. When a tool fails, you set it aside and use something else. You do not argue with it. The unsettling part comes from how comfortable this inactivity was. Modern thinking often associates inactivity with loss of control. Here, inactivity was control. It was the refusal to invest energy where returns were unlikely. The sea was not fought. It was observed and then ignored. These years also shaped how time was experienced. Without departure dates, days blended together. Without arrivals, there were fewer markers. Time stretched. This stretching was not oppressive, it was neutral. Life slowed to the pace of what could be done locally. That pace did not feel empty, it felt manageable. Late-night history lingers in this slowness because it reveals a different relationship with progress. Progress was not assumed to be continuous. It came in pulses separated by long pauses. Those pauses were not viewed as failures. They were simply part of how movement worked in this environment. The sea did not owe anyone cooperation. It did not exist to serve trade or ambition. In years when it withdrew its usefulness, it did so quietly. There were no warnings, no lessons, just a gradual increase in resistance until trying felt unnecessary. By night, the decision not to sail felt even more obvious. Darkness removed any temptation to test conditions. The water reflected nothing. Wind sounded heavier. The sea did not look dangerous. It looked uninterested. That indifference was persuasive. Late-night history does not turn this into a moral, it observes it as a pattern. There were years when the sea worked and years when it did not. People adapted without drama. They did not build narratives around resistance. They built routines around patience. In these years, the harbor remained empty, not because of fear, but because of calculation. The sea had raised the cost of movement beyond what made sense. Waiting became the rational choice. Nothing was lost by staying. Much could be lost by insisting. This quiet decision-making rarely survives in historical imagination. We prefer moments of action. We skip over seasons of restraint. Yet these seasons held everything together. They prevented exhaustion. They preserved resources. They kept communities intact, while the sea did whatever it needed to do. Late-night history stays with these moments because they are honest. They show how much of history is shaped by what did not happen. Ships that did not sail, routes that were not taken, efforts that were deliberately withheld. These absences matter even if they leave no trace. When the sea finally changed its mind, it did so without ceremony. Wind shifted, ice loosened, currents adjusted, movement resumed. No one celebrated the return of cooperation. It was expected. Until then, the years when the sea did not cooperate passed quietly. They did their work by preventing work. They shaped history by insisting on patience and then disappearing without explanation. Ships that stayed still. Ships did not vanish when they stopped moving. They did not dissolve into legend or sink quietly into irrelevance. They remained very much present. They simply refused to participate. In the middle of the 9th century, this was not unusual. A ship resting on land was not a failed ship. It was a ship behaving sensibly. Late-night history pays close attention to these moments because they reveal how easily we confuse movement with meaning. When conditions made sailing inefficient or unnecessary, ships were pulled ashore without ceremony. Hulls were dragged onto ramps and left there like large animals choosing rest over distance. Wood met ground. Weight settled. Nothing about this looked heroic. That was the point. These vessels were not making statements. They were conserving themselves. Remaining intact mattered more than remaining impressive. Once ashore, ships often rested upside down. This position protected the hull and removed temptation. An inverted vessel does not invite departure. It signals pause. Sails were removed and folded away. Rigging loosened. Masts were lowered or detached. What remained was a shape that looked unfinished to later eyes, but perfectly reasonable to those who understood the rhythm of use. Late-night history finds humor in how modern narratives struggle with this image. A ship that does not move feels wrong to us. We imagine ships as ideas rather than objects. They are supposed to go somewhere. They are supposed to carry stories. A ship sitting quietly on land does neither. It simply exists. This makes it difficult to romanticize and therefore easy to ignore. Maintenance filled the time that movement would have taken. Planks were checked, seams were resealed, wear was addressed slowly. Nothing was rushed because nothing was urgent. A ship that would not sail soon did not need to be perfect. It needed to survive the season. This was a different measure of success. Some vessels waited months, others waited years. Waiting did not degrade them. Constant use did. Wood swells and shrinks. Water tests every joint. Rest was not neglect. It was preservation. Ships that waited well lasted longer than ships that insisted on constant relevance. Late-night history notices how little anxiety surrounded this stillness. There was no countdown, no pressure to return to water before a deadline expired. A ship was not considered incomplete while idle. It was considered ready. Readiness did not require motion. It required the possibility of motion at a later time. The presence of multiple resting ships near a harbor did not signal collapse. It signaled calculation. When several vessels stayed ashore at once, it meant conditions were widely understood. No one needed convincing. There were no debates. The sea had raised the cost of travel, and ships responded by withdrawing. Sails hanging in storage told their own quiet story. Fabric that once filled with wind now lay folded and heavy. Ropes relaxed into coils. The tension that defined sailing life disappeared. This absence of tension was intentional. Ships were built to endure stress, but not continuously. Periods of rest were part of their design, even if later storytelling forgot this detail. Late-night history enjoys the irony that we remember ships best when they are moving and forget them when they are behaving responsibly. Motion photographs well, stillness does not. A ship at sea fits neatly into a narrative of progress or danger. A ship on land complicates the story. It asks us to consider restraint as an active choice. The people responsible for these ships understood this without reflection. They did not feel compelled to justify stillness. They had no audience demanding productivity. Their concern was practical. Does the ship survive the season? Does it remain usable when conditions improve? If the answer was yes, then the ship was doing its job. There was also an acceptance that ships did not define time. Time defined ships. Seasons passed regardless of whether a vessel moved. Waiting did not slow history. It simply changed what history looked like during that interval. Ships did not mark progress. They adapted to it. Late-night history lingers on the image of a ship waiting because it disrupts expectations. We are trained to look for events. We are less comfortable observing absence. A line of vessels resting quietly offers no climax. It offers continuity. This continuity is subtle and therefore unsettling. Even when minor repairs were complete, ships did not rush back to water. Completion did not demand immediate use. Readiness was allowed to exist without activation. This is an unfamiliar idea in cultures that equate readiness with deployment. Here, readiness meant restraint. The land itself became part of the ship's life. Soil supported hulls. Grass grew around keels. Weather interacted with vessels differently than it did at sea. This interaction was gentler. The ship aged without being tested. It learned patience by being still. Late-night history notices how these grounded ships rarely appear in chronicles. They do not create drama, they do not threaten or rescue or disappear, they simply occupy space. Their silence leaves little to record. As a result, later generations assume ships were either sailing or lost. The long middle state is missing. This absence in records has shaped our imagination. We picture fleets in constant motion or wreckage at the bottom of water. We forget the long seasons when ships waited quietly within sight of shore. These seasons mattered. They preserved resources. They prevented unnecessary risk. They allowed communities to pause without collapsing. The humor here is quiet. History prefers action because action simplifies storytelling. A ship moving toward danger or success is easy to frame. A ship doing nothing demands patience from the observer. Late-night history is comfortable offering that patience. As evening settled around these resting vessels, there was no sense of failure. The day ended as it always did. Light lowered, shadows lengthened. The ships did not change posture. They did not react to night. They had already accepted stillness. Darkness simply made it more complete. Late-night history does not treat these ships as symbols. It treats them as objects making sensible decisions. They remind us that not all absence is loss. Sometimes absence is maintenance. Sometimes the most effective response to conditions is to stop moving entirely. The unsettling quality comes from realizing how much of history depends on what did not happen. Voyages not taken, risks avoided, ships that stayed on land long enough to matter. These choices shaped outcomes without leaving dramatic evidence. When movement eventually resumed, it did so quietly. Ships returned to water without ceremony. No one marked the moment as a triumph. It was simply time again. The waiting ended because conditions allowed it to end. Until then, the ships had done exactly what they were supposed to do. Late-night history stays with these grounded vessels because they represent a version of competence rarely celebrated. They show how survival often depends on restraint rather than action. They remind us that history moves not only through motion, but through deliberate stillness. Ships that stayed still were not forgotten in their own time. They were trusted. They were preserved. They were allowed to wait. That waiting carried them through seasons that movement would have ruined. In doing nothing, they protected the possibility of doing something later. In a quieter reading of the past, these ships are not interruptions. They are continuities. They hold space between departures. They absorb time without complaint. They remain ready without insisting. That readiness without urgency is unsettling only if we expect history to always move forward. Late-night history is content to sit with ships that chose to stay where they were. The people who stayed when nothing arrived. The harbor did not empty when the ships stopped coming. It simply became quieter in a way that did not require explanation. People were still there. They had not vanished with the trade winds or followed the vessels into memory. They remained close to the water because that was where their lives were arranged. Late-night history pays attention to these people because they rarely appear in records. They did not travel far enough to matter to chroniclers. They did not collapse dramatically enough to attract concern. They stayed and adjusted and kept living in small, reliable ways. Along the edge of the harbor, the days shortened without ceremony. Morning arrived without urgency. There was no rush to prepare cargo or to clear space. The first sounds were practical ones: footsteps on damp ground, wood touched and tested, someone checking a rope that did not need checking yet. These actions were not driven by necessity but by habit. Habit filled the time when work did not. The watchmen had the easiest adjustment. Their role changed very little. They still looked out over water that did not reward their attention. They still walked the same paths. The difference was that nothing interrupted them. No calls from arriving crews. No disputes over space. Watching became closer to waiting. Waiting became a full shift. No one complained. It was the same view either way. Craft workers near the harbor shifted inward. When movement slowed, their work did not disappear. It changed scale. Large repairs were postponed because nothing was under pressure. Small maintenance became enough. A loose plank was secured. A worn edge was smoothed. These were tasks without deadlines. They could be stopped and resumed without consequence. Time softened around them. Late-night history notices how calm this made everything feel. Without arrival times, there was no need to measure hours carefully. Without departure schedules, days lost their edges. Work expanded and contracted according to energy rather than demand. This was not laziness. It was efficiency without an audience. Those who lived closest to the water felt the change most clearly. Their homes were built to accommodate noise and activity. When that noise disappeared, the space felt larger. Conversations carried further. Silence stayed longer. This did not create unease. It created adjustment. People spoke slightly less loudly. They moved without needing to avoid obstacles that were no longer there. Food routines shifted as well. Without visiting crews, consumption patterns simplified, meals became predictable, storage lasted longer. There was less variation, but also less uncertainty. No one waited for goods that might not arrive. Expectations lowered and then stabilized. This was not deprivation. It was recalibration. Children near the harbor noticed the difference without understanding it. Open space where ships might have been became places to linger. They learned the shapes of grounded vessels more intimately. They climbed where movement would normally forbid it. The harbor became a static landscape rather than a transitional one. This was not an improvement or a loss. It was a different version of the same place. Late-night history finds mild humor in how little drama accompanied this shift. Later generations might imagine anxiety or decline. The reality was more mundane. People adjusted routines without speeches or meetings. No one declared a new phase. It simply happened. Those whose work depended indirectly on movement found other uses for their time. Records were reviewed. Tools were repaired. Skills were practiced without pressure. These activities rarely produce stories. They produce continuity. Continuity does not announce itself. The absence of trade also reduced conflict. Fewer strangers meant fewer misunderstandings. Disputes over access or space became rare. The harbor did not need mediation when nothing was competing for it. Calm was not achieved through effort. It arrived naturally when demand left. Late-night history lingers here because this calm does not fit common narratives. We are accustomed to seeing economic slowdown as crisis. In this harbor, slowdown looked like relief. There was less to coordinate, less to explain, less to defend. People still gathered. They still shared time. The difference was that no one was waiting for news from elsewhere. Conversations turned inward. Local matters gained importance. Small observations became sufficient topics. The horizon stopped being a source of expectation. Evenings settled without punctuation. There were no late arrivals to prepare for, no sudden tasks. The harbor darkened gradually and remained as it was. Lamps were lit because it was dark, not because something required illumination. The end of the day arrived on its own terms. Late-night history notices how this lack of urgency changed posture. Bodies moved differently, shoulders lowered, steps slowed. When nothing was at stake, movement became optional. This optionality made daily life feel less compressed. The people of the harbor did not consider themselves idle. They considered themselves available. Availability did not require constant engagement. It required presence. Being there was enough. This presence extended to the water itself. People still looked at it, not with anticipation but with familiarity. The sea did not promise anything. It did not threaten anything. It was simply present. That presence did not demand interpretation. Late-night history finds this especially unsettling because it reveals how much of history operates without tension. We tend to search for moments of pressure. We overlook periods where pressure recedes and leaves behind a steady quiet. No one marked the weeks when nothing happened. They did not need marking. Time passed without ceremony. The harbor remained recognizable. People remained themselves. The absence of ships did not alter identity. It altered tempo. When minor work was completed early, it was not replaced with new obligations. Time remained unfilled. This unfilled time did not produce boredom in the way we might expect. It produced space. Space for repetition. Space for rest. Space for thought that did not need to be resolved. Late-night history avoids turning this into nostalgia. There was nothing idealized about it. Life was not easier. It was simply slower. Slowness did not improve character. It improved pacing. Those months did not feel temporary to the people living through them. They felt normal. There was no sense of waiting for life to resume. Life had not paused. It had changed rhythm. That rhythm held until conditions shifted again. When movement eventually returned, it did not erase what came before. People adjusted back just as quietly as they had adjusted away. The harbor accepted noise again without comment. The months of quiet left no monument. They left habits. Late-night history stays with these people because they demonstrate a version of resilience that does not involve endurance through struggle. It involves acceptance through adjustment. They did not overcome anything. They lived through it. The unsettling part lies in how complete this life was without spectacle. Nothing needed to happen for it to make sense. Nothing needed to arrive to justify the day. Meaning did not depend on motion. The people of the harbor did not see themselves as background to a larger story. They were the story while nothing else was happening. Their routines filled time completely. The absence of trade did not create emptiness. It created a different fullness. Late-night history observes this fullness carefully. It is easy to miss because it does not demand attention. It does not interrupt. It remains steady until someone looks closely enough to notice that nothing is missing. These people lived in months without work, as if work were only one part of existence rather than its definition. That perspective rarely survives into records. It does not create headlines. It creates continuity. In the quiet harbor, life did not shrink. It settled. The people did not disappear. They remained present and adjusted their pace to what the environment allowed. This adjustment did not feel like compromise. It felt like alignment. Late-night history finds comfort in this alignment. It reminds us that history does not always move through effort. Sometimes it moves through restraint. Sometimes it moves through people who stay when nothing arrives and discover that staying is already enough. Trade without cargo. Trade did not disappear when goods stopped moving. It became quieter and less visible, and therefore easier to misunderstand. In the middle of the 9th century, there were long periods when exchange networks paused without collapsing. Nothing arrived, nothing left, yet nothing broke. Late-night history finds these intervals revealing because they expose how much of commerce depends not on movement itself, but on the ability to wait without panic. When goods did not come into the harbor, the absence did not echo. There were no empty wagons lined up as reminders of failure. No crowds gathered to ask where the shipments had gone. The flow simply thinned and then stopped. People noticed, but they did not react theatrically. This was not the first time exchange had slowed. It would not be the last. The system was designed to survive interruptions because interruptions were expected. Markets did not close in protest. They shrank politely. Stalls opened less frequently. Space widened between sellers. Goods already present stayed longer on display. Prices did not spiral into chaos. They adjusted slowly as availability changed. Commerce did not vanish. It compressed. That compression was temporary and understood as such. Late-night history pays attention to how little drama surrounded this contraction. Later economic thinking often frames reduced trade as crisis. In this harbor, it felt more like an inconvenience that had been budgeted for in advance. No one assumed that exchange was guaranteed. Movement was conditional. Everyone involved understood this, even if no one bothered to explain it. Storage became more important than transport during these periods. Warehouses shifted role from holding places to waiting places. Goods were not prepared for immediate distribution. They were preserved. Preservation was a form of participation in trade even when trade itself was dormant. A product that did not move was still part of the network. It was simply resting within it. Those who managed inventories found their work simplified. Without arrivals, there was less to record. Without departures, there was less to organize. Time spent coordinating was replaced with time spent maintaining what already existed. This was not wasted labor. It ensured that when movement returned, the system would not have decayed in the meantime. Late-night history finds a quiet irony here. We often imagine trade networks as fragile webs that collapse when stressed. In reality, these networks were flexible precisely because they were slow. Speed creates vulnerability. Slowness absorbs disruption. A system that expects interruption is rarely surprised by it. Exchange relationships also adjusted. Without frequent contact, trust became local rather than expansive. People traded with those nearby because those were the only transactions that made sense. Long-distance connections did not dissolve. They went dormant. Dormancy was not betrayal. It was understood as seasonal absence. Credit arrangements were handled cautiously. Promises were extended without urgency. Debts did not accelerate into conflict simply because goods were delayed. Everyone involved recognized that the cause was environmental rather than personal. Blame found no useful target and therefore did not settle anywhere. Late-night history notices how restraint replaced expansion during these periods. No one attempted to compensate for lost movement by forcing activity elsewhere. There were no aggressive efforts to invent demand. Demand was allowed to diminish temporarily. This was not seen as weakness, it was seen as realism. The idea of economic collapse requires a sense of dependency that did not exist here. These communities were not built around continuous exchange. They were built around survival with exchange as a supplement. When the supplement disappeared, the core remained intact. Life did not unravel. It narrowed. Those who relied most directly on trade adapted their expectations. Income slowed but did not vanish. Needs adjusted accordingly. Consumption patterns simplified. Luxury became less relevant. Practical goods maintained value. This was not deprivation. It was prioritization without commentary. Late-night history is drawn to how normal this felt. There was no language of emergency, no speeches about recovery. The absence of goods was treated as a condition rather than a problem. Problems demand solutions. Conditions demand patience. This patience shaped how time was perceived economically. Without transactions marking days, the calendar loosened. Accounting slowed. Weeks passed without significant entries. This absence of activity did not create anxiety. It created space. Space for attention to shift away from numbers and toward maintenance. Trade routes themselves did not disappear. They remained mapped mentally even when unused. People knew where goods would come from when they came. Memory preserved connections during inactivity. The network existed conceptually even when it did not function physically. Late-night history finds this conceptual continuity unsettling because it undermines the idea that activity defines existence. The network did not need to perform to remain real. It remained real because people expected it to return eventually. Expectation without urgency sustained it. There was also an acceptance that some goods would not arrive at all. Loss was not dramatized. A missing shipment did not become a mystery. It became a calculation. Effort was redirected toward what could be done locally. This redirection prevented dependency from becoming vulnerability. Markets that remained open during these periods did so quietly. There were fewer voices, less bargaining. Transactions were straightforward. Without scarcity-driven panic, prices stabilized quickly. When choice narrows, negotiation becomes simpler. Commerce becomes calmer. Late-night history notes the mild humor in how boring this makes economic history. Nothing explodes, nothing crashes, nothing demands rescue, trade contracts, and then waits. This does not translate easily into narratives of rise and fall. It resists spectacle. The people involved did not romanticize this period. They did not speak of simpler times or lost abundance. They treated it as a phase. Phases do not require interpretation. They require adjustment. Adjustment happened without ceremony. When goods finally began to move again, the return was quiet. There was no celebration of recovery. Activity resumed because conditions allowed it. The pause ended because it could end. No one credited strategy or foresight. The environment changed. Trade followed. Late-night history lingers on the absence of reaction because it reveals a form of economic literacy that does not depend on growth. Growth was desirable but not mandatory. Stability mattered more than expansion. Expansion would return when it made sense. This approach unsettles modern assumptions. We expect systems to break under inactivity. Here, inactivity preserved the system. By refusing to force movement, people avoided losses that constant engagement would have caused. Trade survived because it was allowed to stop. The quiet months left little evidence. There were no records detailing uneventful days. Historians later see gaps and assume decline. The reality was less dramatic. Life narrowed and then widened again. Commerce followed the same pattern. Late-night history suggests that much of economic resilience lives in these gaps. They show how systems endure by refusing to perform continuously. They reveal competence through restraint rather than innovation. In a harbor where nothing arrives, trade does not vanish. It waits. It rearranges itself. It sheds urgency. Goods do not move, but relationships remain intact. Expectations adjust without resentment. The system survives by doing less rather than more. This survival through contraction challenges the idea that value must always be expressed through activity. Sometimes value is preserved through stillness. Sometimes the most responsible economic action is to pause. Late-night history finds comfort in this because it aligns with how the night works. Darkness does not demand productivity. It allows processes to slow without consequence. Trade in these periods mirrored the night. It receded without disappearing. The unsettling quality comes from recognizing how unnecessary constant motion really is. The harbor did not collapse when goods stopped coming. It adapted. Trade did not die. It slept lightly and woke when conditions changed. These periods rarely receive attention because they resist drama, yet they shaped outcomes quietly. By preventing overextension, they preserved resources. By reducing pressure, they avoided conflict. By narrowing focus, they maintained stability. Late-night history stays with this quiet contraction because it reveals how much of the past operated without urgency. Trade did not define life. It complemented it. When the complement vanished, life remained. In the end, commerce returned, not because of intervention, but because the environment allowed it. Until then, the absence of goods was not a failure. It was a pause that kept the system intact. Trade without cargo looks uneventful from a distance. Up close, it reveals discipline. It shows how restraint can be more effective than action. It reminds us that history often advances by knowing when not to move. A harbor that stored time. A harbor is usually described as a place of arrival and departure. It is measured by movement and noise and the exchange of things that do not intend to stay. Late-night history prefers a quieter reading. In the middle of the 9th century, a northern harbor often functioned as something else entirely. It became a place that stored time, not symbolically, not philosophically, practically. Days entered the harbor and did not leave again. They stacked gently and remained unused without causing alarm. When ships did not arrive, the harbor did not become empty. It became full in a different way. Space that would normally be occupied by movement filled instead with duration. Time slowed and then settled. The harbor held that stillness the same way it held water, without commentary, without impatience. The absence of use did not turn the place into a problem. It turned it into storage. Late-night history notices how well-suited the harbor was for this role. Its structures were already designed to hold things temporarily. Goods passed through. People paused. Ships waited. Extending that pause from hours into weeks did not require redesign. The harbor simply continued doing what it had always done. It held. Paths remained clear without being busy. Posts stood ready without being tested. Warehouses kept their doors closed more often than open. Nothing deteriorated quickly because nothing was being stressed. Time accumulated without friction. This accumulation did not feel heavy. It felt neutral. A day in the harbor without arrivals did not announce itself as unusual. Morning light reached the water as it always did. The edge between land and sea remained unchanged. The difference was not visual, it was procedural. There were fewer decisions to make, fewer adjustments, fewer interruptions. The day unfolded with less resistance. Late-night history finds mild humor in how difficult this is to explain using modern categories. We are accustomed to treating time as something that passes through places rather than something places contain. The harbor challenges this habit. It shows that time can linger. It can settle into corners. It can be held without effort. The people nearby adapted without discussion. When nothing required immediate response, routines expanded to fill the space. Maintenance took longer. Observation replaced action. Tasks were repeated not because they were necessary, but because repetition structured the day. This structure did not feel artificial. It felt sufficient. The harbor did not demand that time be productive. It allowed days to exist without outcome. This allowance is unsettling because it contradicts expectations. We assume places need purpose. The harbor had purpose even when unused. Its purpose was to remain capable. Capability does not require constant demonstration. Late-night history lingers on the idea of waiting as an active state. Waiting in this context was not anticipation. It was suspension. The harbor did not lean toward the future. It rested in the present. The future would arrive when it arrived. Until then, there was no need to prepare excessively. This form of waiting left little evidence. Archaeologically, it looks like absence, fewer objects, less debris, fewer layers of disturbance. Later observers might read this as decline. In reality, it was preservation. By not being used, the harbor avoided wear. Time passed, but damage did not accumulate. The harbor stored unused days the way it stored unused space. It accepted them without judgment. A day without trade was not marked as lost. It was simply a day that stayed where it was. This redefines value in a way that feels uncomfortable. Value was not extracted from time. Time was allowed to remain intact. Late-night history finds this especially revealing. Many historical narratives rely on motion to create meaning. Here, meaning exists without movement. The harbor remains meaningful because it holds potential, rather than because it realizes it. Potential does not need to be fulfilled immediately to be real. Evenings in the harbor during these periods felt extended. Without late arrivals, there was no surge of activity to mark the end of the day. Light faded gradually. Shadows lengthened without signaling anything. The day concluded by exhaustion rather than by event. Time closed itself quietly. The night then settled into the harbor the same way the day had. Nothing changed. Darkness did not activate anything. It did not conceal urgency. It simply reduced visibility. The harbor stored night hours as efficiently as it stored daylight. Everything remained in place. Late-night history notices how calm this storage felt. There was no sense of backlog. Days did not pile up demanding attention. They accumulated and then passed through the harbor without altering it. This kind of endurance rarely receives attention because it does not disrupt. People did not speak of waiting as a condition. They did not label it. It was simply how things were. Language did not inflate the experience. There was no terminology for inactivity because inactivity was not a category. It was part of the rhythm. The harbor as a space of stored time complicates the idea of historical progress. Progress assumes forward motion. Stored time assumes pause. Both existed simultaneously. The harbor held progress in suspension without canceling it. When movement returned, it resumed from where it had stopped. Late-night history finds a quiet irony here. The harbor was most stable when it was least active. Stability did not come from control, but from allowance. By not forcing use, the place preserved its capacity for use later. This challenges modern discomfort with unused space. We tend to fill emptiness quickly. We schedule time aggressively. The harbor did not do this. It left space unclaimed. It let days exist without instruction. There is something unsettling in how complete this felt. Nothing seemed missing. The absence of ships did not create a sense of lack. It created a sense of sufficiency. The harbor was enough as it was. Late-night history stays with this image because it reveals how much of the past was shaped by stillness rather than action. We remember events because they interrupt. We forget pauses because they do not insist. Yet those pauses held everything together. The harbor did not resist time. It absorbed it. Days entered and left without trace. Weeks passed without record. Months settled and then dissolved. The place remained unchanged because it was designed to endure intervals. This endurance did not require awareness. It did not depend on philosophy. It was built into the material choices: wood that tolerated moisture, stone that tolerated neglect, design that tolerated absence. Time passed and nothing demanded response. Late-night history avoids turning this into a lesson. It observes it as a condition that once existed and made sense. The harbor stored time because that was useful. It allowed life to slow without collapsing. It allowed waiting without anxiety. When movement returned, the stored time did not need to be recovered. Nothing was lost. The harbor resumed its other functions without recalibration. The pause had not damaged it. It had protected it. The unsettling quality lies in realizing how unnecessary constant engagement really was. The harbor functioned perfectly while doing very little. It fulfilled its role by remaining open rather than by being busy. Late-night history finds comfort in this because it aligns with the quiet hours of night. The night also stores time. It holds hours that do not need explanation. It allows rest without justification. The harbor and the night understand each other well. In the end, the harbor did not merely wait. It contained waiting. It gave waiting a place to exist without becoming a problem. That capacity is rarely celebrated, but it shaped history in subtle ways. A harbor that stores time does not look impressive. It does not announce importance. It simply remains. It holds days that no one uses and does so without complaint. Late-night history recognizes this as a form of quiet competence. Nothing arrived. Nothing departed. Time stayed and then moved on. The harbor remained ready without insisting. That readiness was not visible in motion, but in restraint. This is the kind of history that unfolds without sound and leaves little trace except stability. The harbor did not ask time to hurry. It let it rest. That decision shaped everything that followed. Silence was not the same as decline. Silence has a habit of being misunderstood. It is often mistaken for absence or failure, or the beginning of collapse. Late-night history prefers to slow down at moments like this because silence in the past rarely meant what later observers assume. In the middle of the 9th century, a quiet harbor was not a sign of decay. It was a sign of restraint. Nothing was falling apart. Nothing was being abandoned. Activity had simply narrowed to what was necessary, and nothing more. A harbor without ships did not look ruined. The structures remained intact. Posts still stood firm. Stone edges kept their shape. Wooden surfaces showed wear that suggested use in the past and readiness for use again. This was not neglect, it was maintenance at the lowest effective level. Things were kept from failing rather than pushed toward improvement. Improvement requires energy. Maintenance requires attention. Attention was available even when ambition was not. Late-night history finds humor in how modern thinking struggles with this distinction. We are accustomed to measuring health by growth. If something is not expanding, we assume it is dying. The harbor disagreed. It demonstrated that stability can exist without momentum. A place can remain functional while doing very little. That idea tends to unsettle observers who expect visible progress as proof of life. Minimal care continued quietly. Damaged planks were replaced when they threatened structure rather than appearance. Loose stones were reset when they risked collapse rather than inconvenience. Ropes were checked occasionally, not because they were needed immediately, but because neglect compounds quickly. None of this created noise or spectacle. It was done because it made sense to do it. The absence of ships did not remove responsibility. It reduced it. Without traffic, there were fewer stresses, less weight, less friction, less urgency. Maintenance became easier because nothing was demanding immediate performance. The harbor rested within its own capacity, rather than being stretched toward constant output. Late-night history pays attention to this resting state because it resists dramatic interpretation. There were no signs warning of impending ruin, no creeping disorder, no sense that time was eroding value. Time passed, but value remained stable because nothing was being consumed aggressively. Silence also reduced competition. When nothing arrived, there was nothing to fight over. Space was plentiful. Access was uncontested. The harbor did not need regulation to maintain order. Order emerged naturally when demand disappeared. This quiet order can look like emptiness to later eyes, but it was a form of balance. People living near the harbor understood this intuitively. They did not interpret quiet as danger. They had experienced it before. They knew that activity came and went according to conditions rather than intention. Silence was not a warning. It was a phase. Phases do not require reaction. They require adjustment. Late-night history finds this adjustment especially revealing. There was no rush to revive activity artificially, no attempt to force relevance, no anxiety-driven innovation. The harbor was allowed to remain quiet because forcing noise would have created unnecessary strain. Restraint was the sensible response. From a distance, a silent harbor might appear abandoned. Up close, it felt occupied. People were present. Tools were stored properly. Paths remained clear. Nothing suggested that the place had been forgotten. It had simply been allowed to slow down. The difference between silence and decline lies in intention. Decline involves loss without replacement. Silence involves pause with preservation. The harbor preserved itself by not demanding more than the environment offered. That choice kept it intact. Late-night history notices how little documentation these periods produced. Records favor disruption. Quiet maintenance does not generate entries. As a result, later readers encounter gaps and assume decay. The gap is not decay, it is a lack of spectacle. Even the physical signs of wear tell a different story when read carefully. Surfaces show controlled aging rather than neglect. Damage appears isolated rather than systemic. Repairs are visible but minimal. This pattern suggests oversight rather than abandonment. Silence also protected the harbor from overuse. When activity slowed, materials recovered. Wood dried. Stress eased. The place regained tolerance for future demands. Decline would have meant erosion accelerating. Silence slowed it. Late-night history finds mild irony in how stability hides itself. A functioning system that is not performing loudly looks fragile to those expecting constant output. In reality, it is often more resilient. It has not exhausted itself. This quiet resilience extended beyond physical structures. Social rhythms stabilized as well. Without constant arrivals, there was less disruption, fewer negotiations, fewer conflicts. The harbor community operated with fewer variables. This simplification reduced strain. Reduced strain preserved cohesion. Silence did not remove purpose, it clarified it. The harbor existed to receive ships when conditions allowed. When conditions did not allow, the correct action was to wait. Waiting was not an error. It was the correct function under those circumstances. Late-night history is drawn to this because it challenges the idea that systems must always demonstrate value through action. Value can exist in readiness. Readiness does not announce itself, it waits. At night, the distinction between silence and decline became even clearer. In darkness, nothing looked abandoned, nothing sagged, nothing collapsed. The harbor rested comfortably. Its outlines remained visible. Its shape held. Silence did not consume it. The unsettling quality of the scene lies in how complete it feels without activity. Nothing seems missing. There is no obvious problem to solve. The harbor does not ask for intervention. It does not suggest urgency. This absence of demand can feel uncomfortable to observers trained to look for crisis. Late-night history resists adding drama where none existed. There was no hidden collapse waiting to be revealed. The harbor did not decay quietly, it endured quietly. Endurance rarely leaves a trace worth narrating. When activity eventually returned, it did not arrive as rescue. It arrived as continuation. The harbor resumed its role without transformation. The quiet period had not weakened it. It had preserved it. This is why silence should not be mistaken for decline. Decline leaves damage. Silence leaves readiness. The difference is subtle and often ignored. Late-night history finds that subtlety worth attention. In many ways, silence was the harbor doing its job correctly. It was responding to conditions by reducing strain. It was protecting itself from unnecessary wear. It was maintaining structure rather than pursuing output. This behavior appears passive only if one expects constant motion. Late-night history suggests that much of what survives from the past does so because of these quiet intervals. They prevent overextension. They allow recovery. They preserve resources. Without them, collapse would be more likely. The harbor did not fear silence, it incorporated it. Silence was not an interruption to its purpose, it was part of its design. That design assumed periods of inactivity and planned for them materially and socially. This assumption is unsettling because it implies that history is not always driven by events. Sometimes it is driven by restraint. Sometimes the most important decision is not to act. Silence in the harbor was not a vacuum. It was filled with maintenance, with presence, with attention that did not seek recognition. Decline would have meant loss of care. Silence meant care without urgency. Late-night history stays with this distinction because it reframes how we read the past. Quiet does not equal failure. In many cases, it equals competence. The harbor remained viable because it did not insist on being busy. Nothing collapsed, nothing disappeared. The harbor simply became quieter for a time. That quiet preserved it. When noise returned, the place was ready to hold it again. Silence was not the end. It was the interval that kept the end from arriving. The year's history did not bother to write down. History is selective in ways that feel polite on the surface and ruthless underneath. It claims to remember what matters but rarely explains its criteria. Late-night history prefers to sit with the years that did not qualify. the years when nothing announced itself loudly enough to be archived. In the middle of the 9th century, there were entire stretches of time that passed without earning a sentence, not because nothing existed, but because nothing competed successfully for attention. Records favor interruption. They lean toward moments that break rhythm rather than sustain it. A battle rearranges a map. A collapse creates debris. A sudden change provides contrast. These moments are easier to notice and easier to justify writing about. A year that resembles the one before, it offers no hook. It does not argue for inclusion. It simply continues. Continuation rarely survives documentation. The year we now label as 850 belonged to this quieter category. It did not interrupt anything. It did not introduce a novelty that demanded explanation. Life moved at a familiar pace and therefore did not register as noteworthy. The absence of events was not considered an event. As a result, the year passed mostly unrecorded. Late-night history finds gentle irony in this. The past is often imagined as crowded with drama. In reality, much of it consisted of people repeating routines that worked well enough. Those routines did not require narration. They were not designed to impress future readers. They were designed to get through the day without unnecessary strain. Sources that survive from this period reveal more through omission than through detail. They speak confidently about disruption and go quiet around stability. A flood receives a date, a raid earns a description, a year without. Either receives silence. This silence is not neutral. It shapes how later generations imagine the past. We inherit a version of history filtered through preference. Preference for conflict. Preference for movement. Preference for moments that feel like decisions. Years that did not demand decisions are treated as empty space between real content. Late-night history lingers in that space because it was not empty to those living inside it. A year like 850 did not feel insignificant to the people inhabiting it. Days still required effort. Weather still influenced outcomes. Work still needed to be done. The difference was that none of it disrupted existing structures. Life fit within expectations. That fit removed urgency. Without urgency, there was little reason to document. Writing was expensive and deliberate. It was reserved for things that needed explanation or preservation. Stability did not need either. Stability was assumed to be self-evident. The problem is that self-evidence fades once the people who assumed it are gone. Late-night history finds mild humor in how confidently later centuries mistake silence for absence. We see blank spaces in records and assume something must have gone wrong. The possibility that nothing went wrong rarely occurs to us. We are trained to see history as a sequence of highlights, rather than as a long stretch of working systems. The idea that a year could be boring feels insulting to modern sensibilities. Boredom implies wasted potential. In the 9th century, boredom was not a category. A year that did not collapse or require rebuilding was a success. Success did not require celebration. It required continuation. Chroniclers had their own constraints. They wrote when there was something to explain or justify. They wrote when power shifted or resources were threatened. They did not write to reassure future generations that things were functioning normally. Normality was not considered fragile enough to record. Late-night history notices how this creates a distorted picture. We receive a past made almost entirely of stress points. Quiet competence disappears. The years that held everything together without spectacle are reduced to nothing. The record suggests instability. Not because instability was constant, but because stability was invisible. The year 850 fits comfortably into this pattern. It was not remarkable enough to compete with more disruptive periods. It did not offer a lesson. It did not provide a warning. It did not require interpretation. As a result, it passed through history without leaving a clear trace. There is also an aesthetic bias at work. Disruption produces stories. Stories require tension. A year of steady routines does not produce tension. It produces continuity. Continuity resists narrative structure. It does not have a beginning or an end that feels meaningful. It simply exists. Late-night history enjoys pointing out that history has preferences much like any storyteller. It favors contrast. It favors momentum. It favors moments that look decisive from a distance. It does not favor years that quietly confirm that systems can work without intervention. This bias affects how we understand the past. We imagine societies lurching from one crisis to the next, because those are the moments that get recorded. The long stretches of equilibrium are lost. This makes the past appear more chaotic than it was, and makes stability seem exceptional rather than normal. People living through these unrecorded years did not feel forgotten. They were not waiting for history to notice them. They were too occupied with living. The idea of being remembered later was not part of daily calculation. Survival and routine mattered more than legacy. Late-night history sits with this because it reframes what it means to matter. A year does not need to be recorded to be essential. Many unrecorded years did the quiet work of preserving structures that later crises would test. Without those years of maintenance, collapse would have arrived sooner. The absence of records also reflects confidence. A society that documents every year is often one that fears instability. Silence suggests trust. Trust that systems will hold. Trust that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough not to require explanation. This trust can be unsettling to modern observers. We are accustomed to monitoring and reporting constantly. The idea that a year could pass without needing to be summarized feels negligent. In the 9th century, it felt efficient. Late-night history does not argue that unrecorded years were perfect. They contained hardship and limitation. They simply did not contain novelty. Hardship that repeats itself does not feel noteworthy. It feels familiar. Familiarity does not invite writing. When later historians look back, they face the challenge of reconstructing silence. Absence becomes a problem to solve. They search for hidden events. They propose theories to explain gaps. Sometimes the explanation is simple. Nothing happened that required attention. The humor lies in how uncomfortable this explanation feels. We want history to justify its existence. We want every year to contribute something visible. A year that does not perform feels like an error. Late-night history suggests that error is ours. The year 850 did not try to be memorable. It did not compete with neighboring years. It did not signal transformation. It simply continued patterns that were already in place. That continuation kept everything functional. These unrecorded years acted as buffers. They absorbed stress by not introducing change. They allowed recovery from previous disruptions. They prepared quietly for future ones. None of this required documentation to be effective. Late-night history finds this deeply unsettling in a calm way. It suggests that much of what shaped the past happened without recognition. The absence of evidence does not equal absence of influence. It often indicates the opposite. When we read history as a chain of dramatic moments, we miss the connective tissue. The unremarkable years provided that connection. They allowed momentum to carry forward. They prevented collapse by refusing to escalate. History did not forget these years out of malice. It simply had other interests. It followed its own taste. That taste leaned toward spectacle. The quiet years did not satisfy it. Late-night history chooses to linger where taste moved on. It listens to what silence implies. It considers the possibility that a year without a story might be doing its job exceptionally well. The unsettling conclusion is that history as we know it is incomplete by design. It excludes what functioned smoothly. It remembers what broke or threatened to break. This makes the past feel more dramatic and more fragile than it was. A year like 850 does not appear in bold. It does not demand annotation. Yet it mattered. It held systems steady. It allowed life to continue without interruption. It passed unnoticed because it succeeded. Late-night history does not try to rescue this year with significance. It observes it with respect. The year did not ask to be remembered. It did not need to be. Silence in the record is not emptiness. It is compression. It contains countless routines and decisions that did not escalate into events. Those routines shaped outcomes quietly. History did not write these years down because it did not need to. The people living them needed no explanation. Only later did the absence become visible. Late-night history rests here because it reveals how much of the past existed without narrative. It reminds us that continuity rarely announces itself. It simply happens until someone notices the gap. The years history did not bother to write down were not wasted. They were busy, holding everything together. What remained when nothing happened? Archaeology is often imagined as the study of what people left behind when they were finished doing something important. Ruins imply drama, objects imply activity, layers imply events stacked on top of each other. Late-night history prefers the quieter evidence, the kind that does not announce itself as evidence at all. In the middle of the 9th century, there were places where the most accurate record of life was not what accumulated, but what did not. When activity slowed or paused entirely, the material world responded in subtle ways. The ground did not fill with debris. The shoreline did not gather the usual scatter of broken wood and worn rope fibers. The harbor floor remained unusually clean. This absence was not intentional. No one was tidying up for the future. It was simply the result of fewer hands moving through space. Sediment settled differently during these periods. Fine layers formed slowly and evenly. There was no churn from constant foot traffic, no disturbance from repeated loading and unloading. Soil rested long enough to behave politely. These calm layers are easy to overlook because they do not interrupt anything. They do not draw attention to themselves. They look like nothing happened because nothing happened loudly enough to leave a mark. Late-night history finds these layers revealing because they resist interpretation. There is no artifact to admire, no structure to reconstruct, only continuity. Archaeologists often have to work harder to notice stability than disruption. A burned layer demands explanation. A smooth layer demands patience. Wooden structures along the harbor edge aged quietly. Without frequent use, planks wore evenly rather than sharply. There were no deep grooves from constant dragging, no concentrated damage points where stress repeated itself. Instead, there was a slow softening of edges. Time touched everything lightly because nothing was insisting on speed. Stone elements behaved similarly. Without vibration or heavy impact, they settled into place. Minor cracks appeared, but did not spread aggressively. Weather worked on them gently, rather than in partnership with strain. This kind of wear suggests presence without pressure. The harbor remained part of daily life without being forced into constant service. Late-night history notices how easy it is to misread this material calm. Later observers might interpret the lack of objects as neglect. In reality, neglect leaves different traces. Neglect allows collapse. What we see here is preservation through inactivity. Things remain intact precisely because they are not being tested. The most striking evidence is often the lack of maritime waste. Harbors that see regular traffic accumulate remnants almost automatically. Fragments of rope, wood chips, food refuse, lost tools. When these are missing, the absence speaks quietly. It suggests that movement did not occur often enough to generate loss. Loss is a byproduct of activity. When people move quickly, things fall. When work intensifies, mistakes increase. When nothing is rushed, nothing is dropped. The archaeological record of a quiet harbor reflects this. It looks incomplete because it lacks clutter. That incompleteness is misleading. It is actually a sign of restraint. Late-night history appreciates how this forces a different reading of evidence. Instead of asking what happened, the question becomes, what did not? What behaviors were absent long enough to leave no trace? This inversion feels uncomfortable because it removes narrative. There is nothing to build toward, only a long, flat line of continuity. Tools found from these periods often show careful maintenance rather than heavy use. Edges are preserved, handles remain intact, repairs are minimal. This suggests that tools were valued and not exhausted. They were used within limits. When work slowed, tools rested too. Even organic material tells a story through its condition. Items that decay rapidly under heavy use survive longer in calm environments. Less disturbance means slower breakdown. Archaeology records this as better preservation, but the reason is not deliberate conservation. It is inactivity. Late-night history finds a mild irony here. The quieter the period, the more likely it is to disappear from historical storytelling, and yet the more likely it is to preserve physical evidence. Silence protects objects even as it erases stories. Paths near the harbor show similar patterns. Without constant movement, surfaces compact slowly. They remain level. There are no sharp ruts, no widening from traffic avoiding obstacles. The path stays narrow because it is not being negotiated aggressively. This indicates predictability. People walked, but they did not hurry. Predictable movement leaves light traces. Erratic movement leaves scars. The archaeological record of these paths suggests life proceeding without urgency. That is difficult to dramatize but easy to confirm when you know what to look for. Late-night history emphasizes that these signs are not conclusions. They are observations. They do not tell us why activity slowed. They only tell us that it did. Speculation adds noise. Absence already speaks clearly enough. One of the most telling indicators is how few repairs appear to have been necessary. Structures were not patched repeatedly. Reinforcements were rare. This implies that loads were light. When things are not stressed, they do not break often. The harbor did not demand constant attention because it was not being pushed. This challenges assumptions about decline. Decline leaves frantic repair, emergency fixes, makeshift solutions. What we see instead is calm maintenance, repair when needed, replacement only when necessary. This suggests confidence rather than desperation. Late-night history stays close to this confidence because it rarely survives into written accounts. Confidence does not shout, it does not justify itself, it simply continues. Archaeology becomes one of the few ways to observe it. The absence of imported material also matters. When trade slows, foreign goods appear less frequently. This is visible not only in what is missing but in what remains dominant. Local materials persist. Everyday objects continue to be used. There is no sudden replacement with alternatives. Life narrows rather than breaks. This narrowing leaves a consistent material signature. Fewer varieties, more repetition, less novelty. Archaeologically, this looks dull. Historically, it looks stable. The difference depends on what the observer expects to find. Late-night history finds it important to resist filling this quiet with imagined drama. The material record does not suggest panic. It suggests adjustment. People used what they had. They maintained what worked. They did not scramble for replacements. Even refuse tells a story through its absence. Less activity produces less waste. Without waste, there is little to excavate. This creates a misleading impression of emptiness. In reality, it reflects efficiency. When nothing is rushed, nothing is wasted. The harbor floor itself becomes a record of restraint. Layers settle evenly. Organic matter decomposes undisturbed. There are no sharp interruptions. This smoothness can be mistaken for lack of use. It is better understood as lack of pressure. Late-night history points out that archaeology is not only about discovering objects, it is about recognizing patterns of non-disruption. Silence leaves its own fingerprints. They are subtle but consistent. These patterns also reveal something about how time was experienced. Without constant change, days blended together. This blending leaves few markers. Archaeology depends on markers to segment time. When time refuses segmentation, it becomes harder to document. That difficulty does not mean nothing occurred. It means events did not demand separation. Life moved at a pace that did not create layers worth naming. This challenges modern habits of categorization. Late-night history finds humor in how frustrating this can be for analysis. Researchers want moments. The past sometimes offers duration instead. Duration is less cooperative. The most unsettling aspect of this material silence is how effective it was. The harbor did not decay during these periods. It remained functional. It was preserved by inactivity. This runs counter to the idea that systems must be exercised constantly to survive. Archaeology shows that rest can be protective. Less movement means less damage. Less damage means longer survival. The harbor endured because it was allowed to pause. These traces of non-activity rarely headline reports. They require context to appreciate. Without context, they look like gaps. With context, they reveal discipline. Late-night history chooses to sit in these gaps. It treats them not as failures of evidence, but as evidence of restraint. The absence of artifacts becomes meaningful when read alongside environmental conditions and structural integrity. What remains when nothing happened is not nothing. It is balance. It is material calm. It is a record of people choosing not to force outcomes. The harbor did not leave behind a dramatic story. It left behind stability. Archaeology captures this quietly. Smooth layers, even wear, minimal debris, tools intact, structures standing. Late-night history does not turn this into a lesson. It observes it as a condition that existed and worked. The past did not always need to announce itself. Sometimes it simply held together. These quiet traces remind us that history is not only written in ruins. It is also written in what did not fall apart, in surfaces that remained level, in objects that lasted longer than expected, in places that endured because they were allowed to rest. When we look closely at these signs of non-activity, we see competence rather than absence. We see systems functioning at low intensity without collapsing. That competence rarely asks to be remembered. Late-night history stays with these archaeological silences because they tell us something uncomfortable. Much of the past was sustained by doing less, by waiting, by allowing time to pass without intervention. Nothing dramatic needed to happen for life to continue. The material record confirms this quietly. It shows us a harbor that remained intact, not because of constant use, but because of restraint. What remained when nothing happened was enough, when the sea remained unused. The sea does not disappear when it is not used. It does not dim or retreat or quietly apologize for failing to participate. It remains present in the same way it always has. Water touches shore. Tides continue their patient motion. Light reflects and then stops reflecting when night arrives. Nothing about the sea suggests that it is waiting for instructions. Late-night history prefers moments like this because they reveal how independent the environment has always been from human intention. In the middle of the 9th century, there were long periods when the sea existed without being activated. Ships stayed on land. Routes went quiet. The surface remained open and available, yet largely ignored. This was not neglect. It was alignment. People understood that the sea did not require constant engagement to justify its presence. It did not belong to them in the way tools belong to hands. Standing at the edge of the water during such a period, the absence of movement did not feel dramatic. The sea did not look unused, it looked unchanged. Waves arrived at the same angle, the sound remained consistent. There was no visual cue announcing that commerce had paused. The sea did not reflect human schedules. It reflected light and weather and gravity. That was enough. Late-night history finds a quiet irony here. Modern thinking often treats natural spaces as dormant when they are not being used, as if usefulness were the measure of existence. In the 9th century, this idea held less weight. The sea was understood as something that existed first and served occasionally. Service was conditional. Existence was not. People living near the water did not feel entitled to constant access. They understood that the sea operated according to conditions that could not be negotiated. Wind arrived when it arrived. Currents shifted without consultation. Ice formed without regard for plans. When the sea became inconvenient, people stepped back, rather than pressing forward. This was not resignation. It was competence. The shoreline during these periods became a place of observation rather than departure. People still walked near the water. They still noticed changes in color and sound. They still adjusted their routines around tides. The difference was that none of this activity aimed at crossing the surface. The sea was present as environment rather than pathway. Late-night history pays attention to this distinction because it is easy to miss. We are accustomed to thinking of the sea as a route. When it stops functioning as a route, we assume something is wrong. In reality, it has simply returned to its default state. It exists without obligation. There was no attempt to fill the unused sea with meaning. People did not invent stories to explain its temporary irrelevance. They did not frame it as hostile or withdrawn. It was simply not useful at the moment. That assessment did not carry emotional weight. Usefulness was not a permanent expectation. The sea during these periods often looked inviting from a distance. Calm surfaces, open horizons. The temptation to interpret appearance as permission was resisted. Experience taught that visual calm did not guarantee cooperation. The sea could look manageable and still impose costs that made effort inefficient. This discrepancy reinforced restraint. Late-night history finds mild humor in how little this restraint required discussion. There were no meetings to decide whether to sail, no formal announcements that routes were closed. Decisions emerged quietly as shared understanding. When no one prepared to leave, that itself was the signal. The unused sea did not feel empty. It felt full of its own processes. Birds continued their patterns. Fish remained active beneath the surface. Tides reshaped edges incrementally. The sea did not pause simply because humans did. Its rhythms continued uninterrupted. Human absence did not register as absence from the sea's perspective. This independence is unsettling in a subtle way. It reminds us that natural spaces do not need our participation to remain active. They are not waiting for us to animate them. They operate continuously on scales that rarely align with human urgency. Late-night history lingers on this because it complicates the idea of ownership. The sea was near, it was visible, it was familiar, yet it was not possessed. People interacted with it when conditions allowed and withdrew when they did not. This relationship was pragmatic rather than sentimental. During periods of non-use, the sea also became quieter in a social sense. Without traffic, there were fewer sounds that signaled human presence. No creaking hulls, no shouted instructions. The dominant sounds returned to water and wind. This shift did not create loneliness. It restored proportion. Proportion mattered. When the sea was not being used, it reminded people of scale. The water extended beyond immediate concerns. It suggested distance without inviting travel. This awareness tempered ambition. It made plans smaller and more local. That narrowing felt appropriate rather than limiting. Late-night history notes how the unused sea did not provoke anxiety about missed opportunities. There was no sense that time was being wasted by not sailing. Opportunity was understood as conditional. It appeared when circumstances aligned. Until then, restraint preserved resources. The absence of use also protected the sea from becoming a constant site of risk. Sailing carried costs. Every journey involved exposure. Choosing not to sail reduced those costs without reducing identity. People did not define themselves solely by movement. They defined themselves by survival. At night, the unused sea became even more clearly itself. Darkness removed visual temptation. The surface disappeared into sound rather than sight. Without light, there was nothing to misread. The sea did not invite interpretation. It simply existed. Late-night history finds comfort in this nighttime relationship. The sea and the night share a refusal to explain themselves. They do not justify their presence. They do not adapt to human preference. They remain consistent. This consistency did not depend on observation. The sea did not behave differently when watched. It did not perform for those standing on shore. Its indifference was not hostile. It was neutral. Neutrality allowed people to step back without feeling rejected. The idea that space does not owe service feels unfamiliar in cultures that prioritize utilization. In the 9th century, this idea was practical. Forcing use where conditions did not support it led to loss. Respecting limits preserved life. Late-night history avoids turning this into a moral statement. It observes a pattern. When the sea was not used, people adjusted rather than insisting. This adjustment maintained balance. It kept systems intact until use became sensible again. The sea did not remember being unused. When conditions changed, it accepted movement without resentment. Water did not require reactivation. It had never stopped functioning. Only human interaction had paused. This return did not require ceremony. Ships entered water when they entered water. The sea did not acknowledge the change. It continued doing what it always did. That continuity made the pause seem less significant in retrospect. Late-night history finds this unsettling because it suggests that many human decisions occur against a backdrop that remains unaffected. We imagine our choices leaving marks. Often they leave none. The unused sea also challenges narratives of decline. Periods without sailing are often interpreted as signs of weakness. In reality, they can be signs of discipline. Choosing not to engage preserved strength. It avoided unnecessary depletion. People who lived near the sea did not need to articulate this logic. They lived it. Their routines reflected awareness without explanation. When the sea was not used, they focused elsewhere. They did not treat this as loss. They treated it as alignment. Late-night history stays close to these moments because they resist drama. There is no climax, no resolution. The sea remains present and unused. Life continues without reference to it. This coexistence feels complete rather than lacking. The unsettling quality emerges when we recognize how little the sea cares about being central to human activity. It does not compete for attention. It does not demand relevance. It remains equally itself, whether used or ignored. This indifference can feel uncomfortable because it undermines the idea that human activity defines space. The sea existed long before ships and continues without them. Use is temporary. Presence is constant. Late-night history does not frame this as a lesson to be learned. It observes it as a condition that existed and functioned. The sea remained unused without consequence. The world did not collapse. Systems adjusted quietly. The shoreline during these periods became a boundary rather than a gateway. Boundaries are not failures. They are limits that make orientation possible. Knowing where not to go can be as important as knowing where to go. The sea as boundary reinforced humility. It reminded people that not all spaces are available at all times. Availability shifts, expectation adjusts. This flexibility preserved life. Late-night history finds mild irony in how modern narratives struggle with this restraint. We often celebrate those who push forward against conditions. The past also celebrated those who knew when not to push. The unused sea did not diminish the harbor. It complemented it. The harbor existed to receive movement when appropriate. When movement was inappropriate, the harbor rested. Both states were functional. This duality is easy to miss. We tend to see function as singular, either active or broken. The harbor and the sea demonstrate a broader range. They function through use and through pause. Late-night history remains with this image because it mirrors the night itself. Night does not serve in the way day does. It allows systems to slow. It permits rest without apology. The sea during these periods behaved like night, present, unused, necessary. In the end, the sea did not withdraw. People withdrew. That distinction matters. It places responsibility where it belongs. The environment remained consistent. Human engagement adjusted. This adjustment did not require explanation. It required awareness. Awareness did not need to be documented. It needed to be practiced. The sea remained there without being used. That fact alone shaped history quietly. It prevented loss. It preserved capacity. It allowed waiting to exist without anxiety. Late-night history finds something deeply unsettling and deeply calming in this. The world continues whether we engage or not. Sometimes the most sensible response is to allow space to exist without demanding that it perform. The sea remained unused and nothing was wrong. Days that passed without needing a name. Morning arrived at the harbor without introduction. Light reached the water the same way it had the day before and the day before that. Nothing in the scene suggested that this morning deserved special attention. The edge of the shore looked familiar. The posts stood where they had been standing. The water moved with no interest in novelty. Late-night history finds comfort in mornings like this because they do not attempt to be remembered. People woke without checking for changes. There was nothing new to confirm or prepare for. The absence of ships had already settled into routine. What might have felt temporary earlier had become ordinary. No one counted the days since the last arrival because counting would have implied expectation. Expectation had been quietly retired. Work began because it was morning, not because it was urgent. Hands reached for the same tools. Feet followed the same paths. Movements repeated themselves without comment. This repetition was not mindless. It was efficient. When nothing changes, there is no need to improvise. Improvisation wastes energy. Late-night history notices how repetition alters time. Without markers, days flatten. One day slides into the next, without resistance. Memory does not bother to separate them because separation would serve no purpose. The past week feels like one extended moment rather than a sequence. This is unsettling only if one expects time to behave dramatically. Meals arrived on schedule without variety. Food was prepared because bodies required it, not because appetite demanded choice. The menu did not need creativity. It needed reliability. Eating became another form of repetition. Nourishment without surprise. Children adapted easily. They are often better at accepting sameness than adults. Without arrivals to interrupt space, the harbor became a predictable landscape. Predictability made play easier. They knew where everything would be. That knowledge reduced excitement, but increased freedom. Late-night history finds mild irony in how uneventful days create their own kind of fullness. When nothing demands attention, attention relaxes. The mind does not brace itself for interruption. It settles. This settling does not feel empty. It feels complete. Sounds repeated themselves as well. Water against wood. Wind passing through familiar gaps. Footsteps crossing ground already shaped by footsteps. These sounds did not announce events. They confirmed continuity. Continuity rarely gets credit for effort. The harbor did not signal the passing of hours through activity. Time was not marked by arrivals or departures. It was marked by fatigue. When the body tired, the day ended. This is one of the oldest ways to measure time, and one of the least documented. Late-night history lingers here because these days resist storytelling. There is no arc, no turning point. Nothing builds, nothing resolves. The day simply exists and then yields to the next one. Narrative habits struggle with this. Life did not. People spoke less about plans and more about tasks. Plans require change. Tasks require presence. Presence was available. Change was not expected. Conversation stayed close to what was immediately visible. The horizon lost its authority. This loss of horizon did not feel like confinement. It felt like relief. Without needing to consider elsewhere, attention returned to what was nearby. Small repairs, familiar faces, known routines. The scale of life shrank and became manageable. Late-night history finds humor in how threatening this sounds to modern ears. A life without milestones or novelty feels like stagnation. In reality, it was stability. Stability does not sparkle, it holds. There were no dates worth circling. No reason to remember one day more than another. This absence of markers meant that memory softened. People remembered the season rather than the date, the rhythm rather than the instance. Records from such periods are thin because there was nothing to justify recording. Writing was reserved for exceptions. Normality did not qualify. The result is a historical silence that later observers misinterpret as emptiness. It was fullness without documentation. Late-night history pays attention to this misinterpretation. We assume that what is not recorded did not matter. In truth, what did not change often mattered most. It kept systems intact. It prevented collapse. It allowed recovery from earlier disruptions. The harbor during these days did not feel paused. It felt settled. Pause implies anticipation. Settled implies acceptance. Acceptance removed tension. Without tension, days did not strain toward resolution. Evenings arrived without ceremony. There were no late tasks to finish, no unexpected demands. Light faded and people followed it indoors. The end of the day did not feel earned. It felt natural. Late-night history notices how repetition changes perception of effort. When tasks repeat, effort decreases. The body learns. The mind relaxes. Work becomes movement rather than challenge. This efficiency is rarely celebrated because it lacks drama. The same faces appeared each day. Familiarity deepened without needing conversation. People knew where others would be. Predictability reduced friction. There was less negotiation, less explanation, less misunderstanding. This reduction made days smoother. Smooth days do not attract attention. They slip past quietly. Later generations looking back find little to hold on to. The absence of stories is mistaken for absence of life. Late-night history insists otherwise. Life was happening continuously. It simply did not escalate. Escalation is what produces stories. Continuation produces endurance. There was also a subtle discipline involved. Repetition requires patience. It demands that people accept sameness without searching for distraction. This patience was not framed as virtue. It was practiced because it was necessary. Without arrivals, there was no external reference point. News did not arrive. Information did not shift. The world outside the harbor felt distant. This distance was not frightening. It was abstract. What mattered was what was present. Late-night history finds this inward focus unsettling in a calm way. Modern life depends on constant input. Remove input and discomfort often follows. In the 9th century, removal of input simplified life. Simplicity was not feared. Days without events allowed observation without urgency. People noticed small changes that would have been missed during busier times. The way light moved across the water, the way wood responded to moisture. These observations did not accumulate into insight. They remained observations. Memory during these days functioned differently. Without landmarks, memory compressed. Weeks later, it was difficult to distinguish one day from another. This was not a problem. It meant that nothing had demanded separation. Late-night history considers this compression important. It shows that time does not always need to be segmented to be lived fully. Segmentation is a tool, not a requirement. The harbor did not push back against repetition. It absorbed it. Structures aged evenly. Paths wore predictably. Nothing broke because nothing was forced. This even aging is visible archaeologically as absence of disruption. The mild humor lies in how modern observers struggle with this calm. We search for hidden crises. We imagine decline. The simpler explanation is that things were working well enough not to require change. Late-night history does not romanticize these days. They were not easy. They were simply consistent. Consistency reduces anxiety, even when resources are limited. People adjusted their expectations quietly. They did not wait for excitement. They accepted the day as it arrived. This acceptance did not require philosophy. It required habit. When night came, it brought no conclusion. The day ended without closure. Tomorrow would resemble today closely enough that closure felt unnecessary. This lack of resolution is unsettling, only if one expects progress to be visible. Late-night history stays with these days because they reveal a truth often overlooked. Much of human history is made of days that do not stand out. Those days do most of the work. The harbor did not mark these days. It did not signal their passing. It simply held them. The water moved. The land stayed. People lived. No one imagined that these days would need defending later. They did not anticipate that silence would be mistaken for absence. They had no reason to justify normality. Late-night history suggests that these repeating days were not interruptions between meaningful events. They were the foundation that allowed events to occur without destroying everything. The unsettling calm comes from realizing how much of the past consisted of time that did not announce itself, time that passed without comment, time that did not demand attention. Days that passed without needing a name did not feel wasted. They felt complete. They filled life quietly. They left few traces because they did not need to. The harbor accepted these days without judgment. It did not ask them to be different. It allowed repetition to do its work. Late-night history rests here because it understands that silence does not mean nothing happened. It often means everything continued exactly as it should. The harbor that remained, even when it was not needed. The harbor did not vanish when it stopped being useful. It did not sink or rot or quietly withdraw from relevance. It remained where it had always been. Wood still met water. Stone still held its edge. The shape of the place did not change simply because nothing was passing through it. Late-night history finds something deeply revealing in this kind of endurance. A place that continues to exist without justification unsettles expectations that tie worth to activity. In the 9th century, usefulness was not assumed to be permanent. A harbor existed because it might be needed again, not because it was needed every day. This distinction mattered. The harbor was not built for constant performance. It was built for recurrence. Its value was future-facing, even when the present offered no demand. From a distance, an unused harbor might appear forgotten. From within, it felt intact. Paths remained clear. Structures stood firm. Nothing sagged under neglect. Nothing was hurried into collapse. The absence of ships did not signal abandonment. It signaled patience embedded into design. Late-night history notices how different this feels from modern spaces that demand justification. Today, an unused structure is often described as failing. Here, inactivity was neutral. The harbor did not owe anyone a reason for existing. Its existence was already reason enough. The materials chosen tell this story quietly. Wood selected for resilience rather than elegance. Stone placed for stability rather than display. These choices assumed periods of stress and periods of rest. Rest was not an afterthought. It was part of the plan. The harbor did not shrink when unused. It did not close itself. It did not redefine its purpose. It remained open without expectation. This openness without urgency created a kind of calm that feels unsettling to observers accustomed to constant optimization. Late-night history finds mild irony in how confidently the harbor ignored the absence of demand. There was no effort to reinvent itself, no attempt to attract activity artificially. It did not advertise. It did not adapt. It waited because waiting did not threaten its identity. People living nearby understood this intuitively. They did not see the harbor as incomplete. They saw it as resting. Resting did not require explanation. It was a familiar state. Infrastructure, during these periods, shifted into preservation mode. Maintenance continued at a level appropriate to inactivity. Enough care to prevent decay, not enough effort to imply urgency. This balance kept the harbor viable without exhausting resources. Late-night history lingers on this balance because it is rarely documented. Records focus on construction and use. They ignore maintenance because maintenance does not feel like history. Yet maintenance is what allows history to continue. An unused harbor also avoided damage. Without traffic, there was less wear. Without loading, there was less strain. The place aged evenly. Even aging is difficult to notice because it lacks contrast. Uneven aging demands attention. Even aging passes quietly. This quiet endurance challenges narratives of decline. Decline leaves traces. Cracks widen, structures fail, materials are scavenged. None of this defines the harbor during these periods. Instead, we see preservation through inactivity. Late-night history finds this deeply calming and slightly ironic. The harbor was strongest when it was least demanded. Strength did not come from use, it came from restraint. There was no pressure to convert the harbor into something else. No rush to assign it a new function. It was allowed to remain what it was even when that role was dormant. This allowance required confidence. Confidence that need would return, or that survival did not depend on constant relevance. The harbor existed as potential rather than performance. Potential does not announce itself. It waits quietly. This waiting unsettles cultures that equate existence with output. Late-night history notes how this patience extended socially. No one campaigned to revive activity prematurely. No one framed quiet as loss. The harbor did not become a symbol of failure. It remained part of the landscape rather than part of the conversation. Time moved differently around such places. Without events to punctuate days, the harbor became background. Background does not disappear. It supports everything else. Even when people passed through, they did so without expectation. They did not look for signs of revival. They did not interpret stillness as warning. The harbor was simply there doing nothing and doing it well. Late-night history finds humor in how uncomfortable this idea feels now. A place that does nothing but exist is often labeled obsolete. In the 9th century, it was labeled prepared. Preparedness did not require demonstration. It required endurance, Endurance required rest. The harbor rested without anxiety. This rest preserved knowledge as well. Skills related to the harbor did not vanish because the harbor remained visible. People remembered how it worked because it remained intact. Memory stayed attached to structure. If the harbor had collapsed or been repurposed, knowledge would have scattered. Instead, knowledge waited with the place. When activity returned, it did not need to be reinvented. Late-night history observes how rarely this continuity is acknowledged. We celebrate construction and rediscovery. We overlook preservation. Preservation feels passive even when it is deliberate. The harbor did not announce its availability. It did not send signals to the future. It simply remained capable. Capability without demand feels unnecessary to modern thinking. In the past, it was practical. The unsettling quality comes from realizing how little effort this required. The harbor survived by being left alone. No intervention, no innovation, just enough care to prevent failure. This contradicts the idea that systems require constant engagement to remain alive. The harbor demonstrates the opposite. Systems often survive best when they are not pushed. Late-night history stays with this image because it mirrors the night itself. Night does not perform. It holds space. It allows recovery. The harbor functioned like night during these periods, present without demand. When use eventually returned, it did so quietly. There was no ceremony. The harbor did not need to be reintroduced. It accepted activity because it had never rejected it. It had simply been waiting. Waiting was not a gap in purpose. It was part of purpose. The harbor existed to receive movement when conditions allowed. When conditions did not allow it, the correct response was to remain. Late-night history does not frame this as wisdom learned. It was simply how things were done. The past did not need to justify restraint. It practiced it. The harbor that remained, even when it was not needed, reveals a form of stability rarely celebrated. Stability that does not depend on constant use. Stability that survives because it is allowed to rest. This rest did not weaken the harbor. It strengthened it. Materials lasted longer. Knowledge remained accessible. The place stayed recognizable. Late-night history suggests that many structures from the past survived not because they were always essential, but because they were allowed to be unnecessary for a time. Being unnecessary did not equal being disposable. It equaled being patient. The harbor held its shape. It kept its edges. It waited without expectation. That waiting carried it through years when nothing arrived and nothing needed to. The unsettling calm of this endurance lies in how ordinary it was. No speeches, no decisions, just continued existence without urgency. The harbor did not ask to be remembered during these years. It did not need to. It remained. And when the moment came again, when it was needed, it did not hesitate. It had never gone anywhere. History also learned how to pause. History is often described as a sequence of events that move forward with determination. One thing replaces another. A moment leads to consequence. Something happens, and then something else follows. Late-night history prefers to slow down before accepting this version too quickly. Between the moments that receive names, there are long stretches where nothing insists on being remembered. These stretches are not accidents. They are not gaps caused by ignorance. They are pauses that history itself allowed to exist. In the 9th century, these pauses were not considered unusual. Life did not demand constant transformation. Communities did not expect visible progress every season. The idea that history must always move forward was not widely practiced. What mattered was that it did not collapse. Stability was more valuable than momentum. When nothing changed dramatically, it meant that systems were functioning well enough to continue without intervention. Late-night history finds quiet irony in how uncomfortable these pauses make later observers. We read timelines looking for motion and feel uneasy when motion slows. We suspect something is missing. We assume decline or confusion or loss of direction. The simpler explanation is often overlooked. Nothing required change. Change did not need to be invented. These pauses were not empty. They were filled with repetition. Repetition does not create headlines, but it creates endurance. Tasks were performed the same way day after day because the method worked. Adjustments were small and local. No one felt compelled to redefine the future because the present was tolerable. That tolerance did not feel passive. It felt appropriate. Late-night history notices how rarely these periods survive in records. Writing favored disruption, a fire deserved description, a sudden shift in power justified ink, a year that resembled the previous one did not. The absence of commentary is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of confidence. Confidence does not ask to be documented. In modern thinking, rest is often treated as delay. Delay implies that something should be happening but is not. In the past, rest was simply another state of operation. A system at rest was not broken. It was conserving itself. This conservation allowed it to survive longer than systems that insisted on constant output. The harbor that stood quiet, the ship that remained on land, the market that shrank politely rather than collapsing. These were not failures. They were examples of restraint, functioning as design. History did not stop during these moments. It slowed to match conditions. Late-night history appreciates the calm discipline this required. Doing nothing is not always easy. It demands resistance to impulse. It requires accepting that action is not always the best response. In periods where resources were limited, restraint was not philosophical. It was practical. These pauses also shaped how time was experienced. Without events to punctuate days, time became smoother. Days blended together. Memory did not separate one from the next because separation would have served no purpose. This flattening of time feels unsettling to those who expect progress to be visible. It felt natural to those who lived within it. Late-night history finds mild humor in how later narratives mistake this smoothness for emptiness. We imagine boredom where there was routine. We imagine stagnation where there was maintenance. We imagine waiting where there was acceptance. These misreadings say more about modern impatience than about the past. Pauses allowed recovery. Materials rested. People rested. Systems rested. Rest reduced strain and prevented damage. A structure not being used does not degrade as quickly as one being forced into constant service. A community not under pressure does not fracture as easily as one pushed to adapt continuously. History also learned that pauses absorb shocks. A society already accustomed to restraint does not panic when conditions worsen. It narrows focus. It relies on what is available. It waits until expansion makes sense again. This flexibility made long-term survival possible. Late-night history emphasizes that these pauses were not strategic in a modern sense. They were not planned. They were accepted. Acceptance did not require explanation. It required awareness. Awareness did not need to be recorded. The irony lies in how much of what survived depended on these quiet intervals. The moments we celebrate often depended on long periods of nothing happening beforehand. Skills were preserved, knowledge remained intact, structures stayed usable. Without these intervals, dramatic moments would have caused more damage. When history resumes visible motion, it does not acknowledge the pause that made it possible. It moves on and leaves stillness behind. Later historians reconstruct action without crediting rest. This creates a skewed image where effort appears constant and success appears sudden. Late-night history prefers to correct this imbalance gently. It points out that continuity requires restraint as much as initiative. Systems that never pause exhaust themselves. Societies that never rest fracture. The past understood this even if it did not explain it. These pauses also reveal a different relationship with uncertainty. When nothing happened, people did not rush to fill the space with meaning. They did not speculate excessively. They did not treat uncertainty as an emergency. They allowed it to exist without resolution. This tolerance for uncertainty is unsettling because it contrasts sharply with modern habits. We demand explanations. We demand forecasts. We demand movement. The past often settled for enough. Late-night history finds calm in this approach. It suggests that not all questions require answers immediately. Not all periods require definition. Some are allowed to pass quietly without being turned into lessons. The years that appear blank in records were often doing the most important work. They were holding things together. They were preventing collapse. They were allowing recovery. They were providing space for systems to reset without being dismantled. These years rarely announce themselves. They do not ask to be remembered. They pass because passing is their function. Memory selects what interrupts. Stability is overlooked because it does not interrupt. Late-night history stays with these overlooked moments because they challenge the idea that history is driven only by action. History is also driven by restraint, by pauses that allow continuation, by silence that prevents breakdown. The unsettling realization is that many of the things we admire in the past survived because nothing happened for a long time, that nothing was not accidental. It was tolerated. It was protected. It was allowed to exist. History did not rush to fill every moment with meaning. It allowed space for time to move at its own pace. Those spaces kept everything else intact. Late-night history does not ask these pauses to justify themselves. It observes them with respect. They were not empty. They were functional. They were necessary. In a world that often confuses movement with progress, these pauses offer a different understanding. Progress sometimes depends on stopping. Survival often depends on restraint. History learned how to pause long before it learned how to accelerate. Those pauses were not mistakes. They were part of how the past remained livable. When we read timelines, we should remember that what looks like silence is often structure holding steady. The absence of events is not absence of life. It is life continuing without drama. Late-night history finds comfort in that. It reminds us that not everything needs to happen all the time. Some of the most important work is done quietly by nothing happening at all. A harbor that slept without explanation. By the time evening arrived, the harbor had already decided that nothing else was going to happen. The decision was not announced. It did not require agreement. Light simply lowered until shapes softened and effort felt unnecessary. Late-night history favors this hour because it reveals how many places do not wait for closure. They stop not because something ends, but because continuing no longer serves a purpose. The harbor at the end of the day did not look abandoned. It looked finished. Wood rested where it had rested all afternoon. Stone held its temperature without complaint. Water moved just enough to remind the edge that it still existed. There was no sense that activity had been interrupted. Activity had already withdrawn on its own. No one gave instructions to close anything. There was nothing to secure beyond what habit already covered. Tools were put away not out of urgency, but because hands were tired. Doors were closed because darkness makes open spaces feel excessive. These actions did not signal an ending. They signaled sufficiency. Late-night history notices how little explanation this requires. Modern narratives often insist on reasons. Why did the harbor fall quiet? Why did movement stop? Why did nothing arrive? The people living here did not ask these questions at this hour. The day was complete without answers. As light faded, the harbor changed in ways that were almost unnoticeable. Shadows lengthened but did not alter meaning. Details disappeared without being replaced. The outline of the place remained legible even as specifics withdrew. This withdrawal did not create uncertainty. It simplified perception. The absence of movement became more apparent in low light. During the day, stillness can be mistaken for waiting. At night, stillness becomes final, in a practical sense. There is nothing left to expect. Darkness removes the possibility of surprise. This removal is calming. Late-night history finds a mild irony here. So much effort is spent during daylight imagining what might happen next. Night arrives and quietly cancels those projections. The harbor accepts this cancellation without resistance. It does not insist on relevance after dark. No voices carried across the water. No instructions were shouted. Sound reduced itself to what could not be turned off. Water against wood, wind against surface. These sounds did not suggest activity. They confirmed presence. Presence was enough. The harbor did not need to justify its quiet. It did not need to frame it as rest or recovery. Quiet was simply what followed daylight. This natural progression made explanation unnecessary. The place did not require narrative to feel complete. Late-night history lingers in this moment because it reveals how rarely conclusions are required. We often imagine that places need endings to feel meaningful. In reality, most days end without ceremony. The harbor demonstrates this perfectly. Nothing is resolved because nothing was unresolved. There is something unsettling in how comfortable this feels. The absence of a grand conclusion removes the satisfaction of understanding. The mind looks for a final note and finds none. The harbor offers no summary. It simply goes dark. The people nearby adjusted without discussion. They did not mark the moment when activity ceased. They had stopped expecting activity hours earlier. By evening, there was nothing left to decide. The day had already settled into itself. Late-night history notices how this lack of decision-making reduces strain. When nothing needs to be chosen, the body relaxes. Shoulders lower. Breathing slows. The harbor mirrors this physical response. It does not tense itself against night. It receives it. The water in low light looks less like a root and more like a surface. Without reflection, it loses depth. It becomes sound rather than sight. This shift discourages interpretation. The sea does not invite thought. It invites rest. Late-night history finds comfort in how the harbor allows this transition. It does not light itself aggressively. It does not try to remain visible. It accepts partial disappearance. Accepting disappearance is a form of confidence. Nothing in the harbor suggests that the quiet is temporary. That suggestion would create expectation. Expectation would require explanation. The harbor avoids both by simply remaining as it is. Quiet is not framed as pause, it is framed as state. This state does not imply decline. Decline carries tension. Quiet carries release. The difference is subtle but important. Decline feels unstable, quiet feels settled. The harbor at night feels settled. Late night history finds gentle humor in how often later observers misread this calm. They see stillness and imagine loss. The people living here saw stillness and recognized completion. The day had done what it needed to do. There were no final tasks left undone, no urgency postponed until morning. What could wait would wait. What could not wait was already finished. This clarity did not require planning. It emerged naturally when nothing remained to be done. As darkness deepened, the harbor lost detail but gained coherence. The fewer elements that remained visible, the more unified the scene became. Complexity receded. Simplicity took over. This simplification felt intentional, even though it was not designed. Late-night history stays here because this moment resists interpretation. There is no lesson to extract, no moral to assign. The harbor sleeps because sleep follows wakefulness. That is all. The unsettling part comes from realizing how unnecessary explanation often is. We are trained to connect every state to a cause. Here, the cause is time. Time passing does not require justification. The harbor does not prepare a statement for the future. It does not archive its quiet. It does not mark this night as different from the one before. Nights blur together the way days do when nothing demands separation. Late-night history finds this blur honest. It reflects how life is experienced rather than how it is recorded. Experience does not organize itself into chapters. It flows until it stops flowing. The absence of a conclusion also protects the harbor from over-interpretation. Without a defined ending, there is nothing to analyze. The night exists for itself. The harbor exists within it. People went indoors not because the harbor required protection, but because bodies seek shelter when light fades. This instinct did not need reinforcement. It operated without thought. Late-night history notices how few lights were left burning. Darkness was allowed to dominate. This choice reduced effort. Reduced effort preserved energy. The harbor did not compete with night, it cooperated. There was no sense of loss in this cooperation. The harbor did not mourn what did not happen. It did not compare the day to a busier one. Comparison creates dissatisfaction. The harbor did not compare. By the time the night fully settled, the place felt complete in its quiet. Nothing was missing. Nothing was delayed. Nothing was waiting just out of sight. Late-night history rests here because this is where explanation ends. Not because answers were found, but because questions no longer mattered. The harbor slept without explanation because explanation was unnecessary. There is a calm discipline in this. It suggests that not every state requires interpretation. Some states are simply correct for the moment they occupy. The harbor did not ask the night to mean anything. It did not ask history to notice. It did not ask the future to remember. It allowed itself to be exactly what it was in that hour. That allowance is unsettling because it removes the need for narrative. It leaves only presence. Late-night history understands that presence is enough. When nothing moved and history did not mind. The harbor does not announce its ending. It simply becomes quieter until quiet feels like the correct state. There is no final moment when activity officially stops. It thins, it loosens, it drifts away without asking for acknowledgement. Late night history finds comfort here because it shows that history does not always need motion to justify itself. Sometimes continuation is enough. When no ships arrive, the harbor does not panic. It does not reframe its purpose or apologize for being underused. Wood remains where it is. Stone holds its shape. Water touches the edge with the same patience it always has. Nothing about the place suggests that something has gone wrong. The absence of movement feels settled rather than unfinished. This is where many narratives grow uncomfortable. We are trained to look for conclusions. We want closure or collapse, or at least an explanation. The harbor offers none. It does not explain why ships did not come. It does not promise that they will return. It simply remains present. Presence without commentary can feel unsettling when one expects history to perform. Late night history lingers here because this moment reveals something easy to forget. History is not obligated to entertain. It does not exist to maintain tension or to deliver lessons on schedule. Much of it passes quietly, while nothing changes enough to deserve attention. These stretches do not weaken the story. They hold it together. The harbor at rest does not feel abandoned. Abandonment carries neglect. This place shows care without urgency. Minimal maintenance continues because habit continues, not because a future demands it. Care does not always need a goal. Sometimes it exists to prevent things from falling apart. Time moves differently here. Without arrivals or departures, there are fewer markers. Days blend. Evenings arrive without punctuation. Night settles without drama. This smoothness makes time harder to remember, but easier to live. Memory does not separate what does not need separation. Late night history notices the mild irony in how often we mistake this smoothness for emptiness. We see silence and imagine loss. The people who lived near this harbor recognized silence as sufficiency. Nothing was missing that needed to be replaced. Nothing was delayed that required urgency. The lack of ships does not interrupt history. It reveals another mode of it, a mode where restraint replaces action, where waiting is not anticipation but alignment. The harbor does not wait for history to resume. History never left. It simply slowed to a pace that matched conditions. There is no climax here because there does not need to be one. The harbor sleeps not as an ending but as a continuation. Sleep follows wakefulness without asking for justification. The place does what bodies do. It rests when effort no longer makes sense. Late night history finds this deeply calming and slightly unsettling. Calming because it removes pressure, unsettling because it refuses to explain itself. We are used to meaning being delivered through change. Here, meaning exists without change. That challenges habits of interpretation. Nothing about this moment asks to be remembered. That does not make it insignificant. Many of the most durable periods of the past passed without record because they worked. They did not disrupt. They did not demand repair. They allowed systems to remain intact. When ships eventually return, they will not rescue the harbor from failure. They will simply use it again. The quiet period will not be framed as a problem that needed solving. It will be forgotten because forgetting is how history treats things that function quietly. Late night history rests here at the end because this is where explanation runs out. Not because answers are missing, but because answers are unnecessary. The harbor exists, time passes, nothing moves, Nothing needs to. This is not the absence of history. It is history continuing without spectacle.